Hi everybody, welcome to an A2 micro revision session, which is going to be looking at one of those theoretical market structures that come up in questions all the time. This one is perfect competition. So what is perfect competition? It's best, as in most market structures, it's best defined by the key characteristics, or sometimes the phrase used is the architecture of a market. Because we make assumptions about this particular type of market, and those assumptions very much shape the conduct and the behavior and the choices that firms make. Now, one way of remembering the essence of perfect competition is to think of the phrase, or the mnemonic, half PPP. Half PPP. Let's go through it and see what it looks like. First key characteristic is that all the firms in the market, and there are many of them, they are assumed to produce homogeneous products. In other words, these products are standardized, they're essentially the same, and in economic speak we say that they're perfect substitutes for each other. The A is that all firms have access to factors of production. Look, I know what you're saying, that's not really an A, is it? But this is how we get to half PPP. All firms have access to factors of production. This goes back to one of the key characteristics of a contestable market, and that is that the technology, the prevailing production technologies that are available to all the firms in the market, including those who might come in the long run. So factors of production are mobile, and all firms have access to them. Really key feature of perfect competition is that the concentration ratio is very low, and this is because there are a very large number of buyers and also sellers in the market. No one firm on their own, no one business has any effective, significant control over the market. A really key assumption is that of free entry and exit. Entry to the market, responding to price and profit signals. Exit from the market, for example, if a firm is making significant losses in the short term. So that's the half bit. What about the PPP bit? Well, one of the P's stands for perfectly elastic demand. This goes back to the fact that all the firms in this market are producing the same product. Effectively, this means that each firm has no day-to-day control over the price. They have to accept the market price as given. We say that firms in perfect competition are price takers. They each face a perfectly elastic demand curve, even though the demand curve in the market as a whole is highly likely to be downward sloping. Second P is the idea of the assumption of perfect knowledge and perfect information. So all the agents in the market, buyers and sellers, they have easily available, readily accessible and free, costless knowledge and information. They know which firms are selling at which prices. And if one firm deviates from the market price, that knowledge is immediately transferred to other consumers in the market. Equally, a technological breakthrough is again very quickly and immediately diffused across all the firms in the sector. Perfect knowledge is a key characteristic. And finally, we're going to assume that businesses, firms in the market, the sellers, they are profit maximizers. They're going to be looking for an output where marginal cost meets marginal revenue. So firms are assumed to be profit maximizers. Consumers are assumed to be utility maximizers. Now, these assumptions are severe, and they give perfect competition the veneer of being a very unrealistic market, because one can challenge and question all of these assumptions, and certainly we'll do that in a few minutes. Now, perfect competition, when you're drawing an analysis diagram in the exam, it's really important to impress the examiners with the quality of the diagrams you draw. When you're doing perfect competition, it's important to draw two separate diagrams. On the left-hand side here, we have the industry, or the market supply and demand. This is the sum of all the supply curves of the firms to give us the supply curve, and the sum of the individual demand of consumers to give us the demand curve. This means that the market price of P1, an equilibrium price, is established, and that green dotted line goes across from the left-hand diagram to the right-hand diagram, each firm is assumed to be a price taker. So that price P1 becomes effectively the demand curve for the individual representative firm in the market, as shown on the right-hand side. So on the left-hand side you have the industry. On the right-hand side, you have a representative individual firm in this perfectly competitive model. Now that price becomes their demand curve. It becomes the AR curve. And if average revenue is constant, it will also equal marginal revenue. A profit maximizing business will find an output, in this case Q1, where marginal cost equals price, or when marginal cost equals marginal revenue, because that's going to be at the same point. So profit maximizing firms will find an output where marginal cost meets marginal revenue, when marginal cost meets the price. I'll come back to that in a minute. That gives us output Q1. From Q1 we can work out that the cost per unit is C1, and because the price is higher than the cost, the shaded area here shows the level of supernormal profits. Profits above that needed to keep the firm in its present use, certainly in the short term. Now that is the standard diagram to draw when you're drawing a perfectly competitive market. In this case, the firm is making quite substantial profits. That doesn't have to be the case. It could be the market price is very low, in which case some firms may be making a loss. Let's have a look at a multiple choice question. This is really for the Edexcel students amongst you. The competition appears quite regularly on the paper. So here's a question. Sally's farm grows and sells potatoes, and she aims to maximize profit. This bit is really key. She believes that the market price of potatoes will not be affected by changes in her farm's output. Now that phrase, the market price of potatoes will not be affected, really gives you the clue that we're talking here about perfect competition. So clearly B, for example, is going to be wrong. It's perfect competition. If we go back to our diagram, we said that a profit maximizing firm will take the price P1, that becomes their average marginal revenue curve, and they're going to find an output where marginal cost meets marginal revenue, and also where marginal cost meets the price. Let's go back to our question. Then it looks like the answer is going to be C. Sally will produce at a level of output where marginal cost equals price in the short run. Edexcel fans, 1 mark for getting the right answer, 1 mark in the explanation for defining profit maximization, and 2 marks for drawing this diagram. I expect to see lots and lots of diagrams in the Edexcel multiple choice paper. That really is a great way of just getting those extra marks. Here's another perfect competition multiple choice question. So we're given the revenue and cost conditions for an industry and 1 representative profit maximizing firm. And this should be familiar to you. On the left hand side is the industry's supply and demand curve, and on the right hand side a firm's cost and revenue curves. They're taking the price P, which becomes their demand curve. Now the profit maximizing output is T, but at T the price they're getting, P1, is lower than average cost, so you could shade in the losses there, but higher than average variable cost. So they're getting a price which is sufficient to cover their variable cost of production, but not quite sufficient to cover their fixed cost of production, meaning they're going to make a loss. Fans of the concept of the shutdown point, or the shutdown price, will know that a firm in perfect competition will continue to produce in the short term as long as the price they're getting is greater than the average variable cost. So because P1 is higher than AVC on this right-hand diagram, the firm will continue to produce. However, it's making a loss. So the answer is D. The firm is making a loss and will continue producing in the short run. But clearly, and you can show the loss in the diagram, annotated and shaded, but clearly in the long run, they'll need a higher price sufficient to cover average cost, because if they cover their unit costs, they're making normal profit. And here's another question. Now this is an interesting one. This is something that students oftentimes get quite confused in the exam. Amazing how many students think this is perfect competition. It's not, it's monopolistic competition. So a small profit maximizing cafe has cost of revenue curves as shown. It is noted that the cafe is never full. And this diagram, if you, those of you who've done a lot of revision already ahead of the exams, and I hope you have, this diagram, of course, is the long-run equilibrium for monopolistic competition, where at output QE, which is a profit maximizing output, the price, PE, just equals the average cost of production. They're making normal profits at price PE and output QE. But it's not at the lowest point of the unit cost curve. So this is the output QE, but they're not at the lowest point of the average cost curve. So they're productively inefficient. This is a long run diagram showing productive inefficiency. The answer there is A. So in perfect competition, one of the things one is asked to talk about is how the market will adjust as new firms enter the industry in response to high supernormal profits. We think back to our original diagram. We showed that that firm at price P1 was making quite a hefty, significant profit. Price was above average cost. What happens in the market if that is true for most of the firms? Well, the answer is shown in this slide. On the left-hand side, we assume that the high level of supernormal profits in the short term is going to attract new entrants into the market. New firms will come in, each producing the same standardized good or service. The result of new firms coming in is that the market supply curve shifts out from S1 to S2, and the market price will fall from P1 down to P2. In other words, the entry of new firms in a competitive market will compete away the supernormal profits of existing firms in the industry. The arrival of new firms producing the same product will cause an increase in supply, a fall in price, and that will, in inverted commas, compete away the supernormal profits. This process will continue until you reach an equilibrium. That is going to be at price P2. If we take that price across to the right-hand side here and make that the demand curve AR2, MR2, at that new price P2, this firm is profit maximizing an output Q2, and the price they're getting is just enough to cover their average costs. They're not making any supernormal profits. At Q2, this firm is making normal profit, and that is the long run equilibrium diagram for this market. Now, when one's talking about competitive sectors, competitive markets, it's incredibly important today just to be able to talk about the three types of efficiency. Allocative efficiency is essentially out of optimizing the allocation of scarce resources. One of the conditions for allocative efficiency is that the price charged by suppliers is a fair reflection of the marginal cost of supply. In a competitive market, that will be the case. Productive efficiency is when firms in the market are selling their goods and services at or very close to the lowest point of their short run or their long run average cost curve. In other words, they're basically supplying what they're producing at the lowest feasible unit cost. And dynamic efficiency, well, that's a harder one to show in a diagram, but dynamic comes about as producers get better at supplying goods and services, as the quality of output improves, perhaps arising from innovation in a sector funded perhaps by profit. Dynamic is all about meeting people's changing needs and wants over time. So how does perfect competition stretch up when it comes to efficiency? Well, the answer is that we can only really show two types of efficiency on the diagram. Let's go back to our long run equilibrium at price P2. The price is the same as the marginal cost. So in that sense, the market price is achieving allocative efficiency, and the output level Q2 is also at the minimum point of the average cost curve. So yes, perfect competition gives us an allocative and productively efficient outcome. However, when it comes to dynamic efficiency, given that the profitability of these firms is going to be at or close to just normal in the long run, one could argue there's less incentive for firms to research and innovate and try and achieve significant technological breakthroughs. If they did, many of those would immediately become available to other firms in the market. So perfect competition is good for allocative and productive efficiency, but it may not necessarily be that good for dynamic efficiency. You might turn instead to markets such as monopoly or a competitive, contestable oligopoly for a greater level of dynamic efficiency. Finally, I just want to finish off by just questioning and challenging the core assumptions of the perfect competition model. It's clearly a model which belongs basically in the textbooks, in the theory textbooks. We get pretty close when it comes to, for the sake of argument, 50 very similar nightclubs in a Spanish resort. We've all been there. It gets pretty close if you might have 30 or 40 bookmakers on an on-course race course or greyhound racing, all charging very similar odds. And we get pretty close to perfect competition when you have a whole series of whatever fish and chip shops on a seafront. Maybe a dozen fish and chip shops basically selling the same product and pretty much charging the same price. So we can come close to perfect competition, but the reality is, of course, the assumptions are so severe, so restrictive, that the model has a theoretical curiosity, but perhaps less of a real world application. Why is this? Well, most firms, most businesses actually do choose the price they set. They may not necessarily use the most latest mathematically high-powered algorithms to set their profit maximizing price. I know of one or two well-known high street businesses, including those that sell a lot of chicken and Coke, that essentially just set their price based on a rule of thumb, what feels right. But firms have price setting power, and once that's the case, you're no longer in a world of perfect competition. Secondly, as I'll show you some examples in a second, we just live in a world where markets are saturated with similar products, but they're not the same goods and services. There was real competition between businesses. It's all about oftentimes quite subtle advertising-led differences in the quality or the performance of a product. These goods and services are differentiated. They're branded. And of course, that takes us away from this model. We live in a world of complexity. We live in a world where people don't necessarily understand the characteristics of the painkillers they're taking, or the pensions they're buying, or the cars they're purchasing. So we live in a world of complexity, and that allows us to drop the assumption of perfect competition. Indeed, many of you at AS level would have studied information failure as a cause of market failure. And even in today's digital world, where people can search for prices at the click of a mouse, and they can log on to price comparison sites, even then, you can't avoid search costs. And actually, many of these price comparison websites only offer you a selection of prices of different goods and services in markets. It's not the same thing as having access to full information. In the real world, intellectual property and technological breakthroughs are protected by the patenting system and by trademarks and copyright. Firms looking to protect the innovations that they have. And those of you who have revised contestable markets know that there's no such thing really as a market where entry is costless and exit has no penalty. That is a theoretical idea. There are always some barriers to entry and always some costs to incur if you decide to leave. I think crucially, this last slide really says it all. We live in a world where if these are the things you consume on a regular basis, and they certainly are for me, then businesses all the time are looking to differentiate their products. I've chosen these because these are examples of consumer-facing products: ice cream, jelly babies, Alco Pops, where existing firms have to reinvent products and give them slightly new twists and flavors and appearance in order to extend the product life cycle. This is the essence, is it not, of real competition in markets? That if you're a big Jelly Babies fan, the berry mix could be the key factor that gets you to buy the product. And these are clearly not perfectly competitive markets. So there we've spent 20 minutes or so working our way